Behind me is the triptych called The Debatable Land, hanging at Traquair House, and I'm with the artist Peter Sachs. Peter, first of all, tell me how the genesis of this idea came about.
Well, Mark Muller, who has been obviously a resident but also the founder of this festival and somebody devoted to trying to evoke the history of Scotland, approached me, knowing that I was both a poet and a painter, but now particularly a painter, to ask if I might try to make some sort of encyclopedic wall painting that would conjure the history but also the topography of Scotland, the nature of Scottish identity, the relation with England. And he was aware that I like to make these sort of encyclopedic cave paintings or frescoes, and that I could also incorporate real materials from here. So he suggested that I see whether I could come up with something that would also be timed to the upcoming referendum.
And the interesting allusion there is to cave painting, the idea of something that takes us back to previous time, to our folk memories, to our own personal histories.
Yes.
And that's obviously something that is a poetic impulse in you as well as a painterly one.
Yes, that's a beautiful perception, because in fact I'm by origin South African. The first paintings I ever saw were cave paintings, and the cave paintings were redolent with the indigenous makers. So I'm devoted to work that is not only creating an image, but is itself part of a terrestrial landscape, just as this is now to be part of this environment, a wall painting, part of Scotland, part of something whose materials are from
So
here.
it's contemporary, but it takes us back, and describe us how you began to execute that, how you began to turn that idea into physicality.
Well, that's a very, very time-consuming and laborious, very physical process, and I have to say part of the archaeology of making this, which does take one back to the past, is thematic as well, in that I drew on many, many materials going back to the Arbroath in 1320, or even the geological writings about this country. And so what I did is I took these three panels, since I imagined it as a triptych, and the triptych would be my notion of how cave paintings made it into medieval altarpieces, frescoes, and so on.
The story of a nation.
Exactly, the story of a nation. And I laid these on the floor, and I began by using pieces of cloth, which is very important to me because I'm not only interested in painting, I'm interested in the texture of fabric and the idea of things being fabricated by hand. So I began by laying down a composition that was visual, and above all, however thematic this is, I wanted to remain a visual object. And so I started layering these things down, and there's about 11 layers of materials.
And in that sense, it's a landscape of the mind and the memory.
Yes, it's a landscape of the mind and the memory, but it has some topographical motifs in that.
So show some of the...
Well, if one is seeing it from further back, it could be that this is a Scottish mountain, which would be fairly iconic, this pyramidal form in the middle. It could be that many of these stream-like forms of cloth descending are rivers, which might indeed end up in something like the Tweed, which would be a border. So I'm fascinated by borders. This is the debatable land, but it's also a question of union and disunion, so that even a document like the Articles of Union are disposed on either side of this divide, or the signing of the agreement puts Salmond on one side and Cameron on the other. There's a playful use of topography.
Yes, and I noticed, for example, we've got the green leather benches of the Palace of Westminster here, and Salmond and Cameron talking after the signing of the Edinburgh Agreement. So what you've done is to produce the human story of the various acts and pronouncements that have got us to where we are.
Yes.
And when you say the debatable land, are you saying this is what is up for grabs?
In a way, I'm making just as the painting is itself layered, the title is layered. And of course, the debatable land was the term applied to the border regions during those wars and the questions of sovereignty.
Which side?
Yeah, and it was just referred to as the debatable land, same area out of which came all the great border ballads. But the land is now up for debate again, as you've just been doing that session. And I thought it would be a historical document, a trove, a kind of piece of evidence of where the gathered history of Scotland has come to that could be a subject of debate in its own right.
Well, you talk about gathered history.
Yes.
What strikes me about the inspiration behind this and your devotion to the triptych that we see in front of us is that you accept or have come to believe that this is a great debate, that it's not just another piece of political badinage on one side or the other, as we have in a general election, that this is of a different order.
Yes, I do feel it to be both local and in some sense international, because I think it taps into large questions of identity. Where am I from? To what degree am I constituted by my background, both in terms of a land and the kinds of language.
And even if I know where I am and who I am and where I come from, what do I make of that in the modern world? I mean, there's a great argument now between people who say, look, I don't need a vote in the referendum to tell me that Scotland is a nation. It is a nation. Yes. I know I'm Scottish. It is a place with a history. You've got some of it here. Others would say, hang on, it isn't properly a nation with a history that has come to life unless it once again regains its sovereignty. And that's the nature of the argument. Not whether it's a nation, but how the nation should be represented in 2014.
Yes, that's a fair point. And I'm just hoping that this painting becomes a kind of visual materialization of what I think has been one of the principal fruits of this, which is bringing to consciousness. That's why I like this idea of going back to almost prehistoric roots and bringing it up to the mind, bringing up to the surface all that lies below.
And it's a guide, really, I suppose, to what is at stake.
Yes.
What's there, what the accumulation,
the
accretion of memory is.
Well, I like to think of this as a kind of debris field of history, which has been gathered up for the present, and I also think of it as some sort of long letter or document that's being written towards the future.
Can you take us on a path from one side to another?
Yes, and I love the idea that you've used the word path, because it is, being a topography, it is meant to have many itineraries.
You can go wandering and you can
go wandering and you can go meandering, and each viewer, there is the long view, but then just as in life, you might have a long view about the Scottish question, but then when you're up close, you take your own. So I start up in the right-hand corner, let's say, and I've got a window frame. And indeed, there is a piece of actual embroidered cloth from Traquair, since Mark brought me bits and pieces of the wall, of the window frames, of the harling, and said, can you incorporate these materially into the surface of your painting? So this is a piece of embroidery that happens to include a descending bird. Now, as you know, particularly in alt pieces, the bird is an icon of annunciation or a messenger or something that seems to be coming, to my mind, through the window, and then will perhaps fly across this landscape, which would be an aerial view. And one of the views I want of this is a kind of aerial perspective. And there are other birds that make their way across. And I can just keep following the trajectory. The bird will fly over, let's say, this mountain. It will encounter other birds. From the left, on the other hand, if I were to take you through, I'd start over there with the dog. And the dog, of course, keeps its paws on the ground. So one has these two jostling ways of...
As the dog works its way across the triptych, what we see are pieces of writing. They're parts of our story, they're bits of our history. There are the things that remain when we've moved on. The things that have made us who we are.
Yes, and the dogs are, of course, scenting their way through, they're hunting their way through. These are hunting dogs. Traquair was a hunting lodge going back to the 11th century. And so I purposely, the image comes from the wall in the house, and then the dogs move here, it comes back again, and it will make its way toward, let's say, these aspects of history. Another dog approaching the Articles of Union, so this dog now makes it into 1707, and it exits the painting all the way on the right, just above the image of the new Scottish Parliament. So there are these different pathways. You can follow the bird, you can follow the dogs, or you can follow the meandering streams, almost like a contour map of the typed, and that's all my own hand typing.
And it seems that one of the forceful aspects of this work is that what you're saying, or what you're revealing to us, is that our past is our present, that you can't separate the arguments, the decision that will be made on September the 18th from the story. Wherever you stand in this argument, all these things are part of our present. There is no distinction.
Correct. And for me, this became a work of not just representing, but truly of researching and discovering and excavating for myself knowledge of Scotland that I did not have. For example, in typing out the actual details of the letter of the Arbroath Proclamation, which was 1320, when I came to all the names who had signed that document, it was fascinating to me that one of the names was John Cameron. So it seemed rather ironic that the person who was appealing to the Pope for the independence of Scotland was part of the lineage of the man who is now signing over here opposite his counterpart the question of what Scotland's fate should be. Just as I was interested to find we were having this debate, I was listening to you just a moment ago, the question of not many Scottish people know that in 1713, 6 years after the Act of Union, there was a bill brought to the House of Lords about dissolving it. Yeah. And the vote was very narrow. So I've actually got that document in here and moved it up to here as well with the actual indication of the votes. And it was very close. It was 71 to 67 with the ink stroke for each vote. And
only
so
6 years after the Act of Union.
There we are.
And here we are in a house redolent
yes.
of Scottish history.
Yes.
Where the gates were closed as Prince Charles Edward Stuart left for the last time and won't be opened until another Stuart is on the throne.
Yes.
Traquair is at the heart of Scotland's story.
Yes.
And what you've done is to try to represent something of the texture of that story.
I'm glad you used that word because there's a lot of text in here. But as we know, the same word for text, a literary text, a political text, is the same as the word for texture or the same as the word for textile. And it is a kind of weaving. And I think that Scottish identity, questions of political unity, they are fabrics. And they are woven and they can be unwoven. And in this case, this is a weaving together of all of these different threads, some of them quite literally taken from Traquair House, such as this piece over here is a thread of an old 19th century carpet that Mark brought to me, just as that piece of wood up there is a piece of an old window frame that I've incorporated into the painting, but both as an embodiment of the actual terrestrial physical life of this place, which invites us to relate to the painting in a bodily way, but also just as a visual compositional form, you know, a diagonal that will come down, hit this window, move onto the thread, come across and make its way out into other references to windows. So there's these formal principles as well as the material embodiments.
Peter Sachs, poet and artist, thank you very much. And the Debatable Land, his triptych, is hanging now at Traquair House.